I'm John Gimigliano, Principal in charge of KPMG's Federal Legislative and Regulatory Services Group in Washington National Tax. Thanks for joining me today. On November 6th, KPMG sponsored and co-hosted a post-election event with Bloomberg B&A, where several key Capitol Hill tax writing staffers discussed the prospects for tax reform in the coming Congress. There was spirited interaction on this subject, and I think it's worth revisiting a few key points from that discussion. First, one of the things that jumps out from the panel is to what extent the Tax Reform Act of 1986 casts a long shadow over the present-day considerations of tax reform. More than 28 years on, it seems that some of the key thinkers on tax reform, including these panelists, are still animated by and driven by the path that the 1986 bill took to the Rose Garden and President Reagan's signature. Again and again in the discussion, the panelists reference back to the 1986 process of enacting tax reform as the blueprint for today. It's an interesting point of view since the broad goals today are nearly the same as 1986, although I believe that because we have different circumstances and different personalities involved, that the path to presidential signature, should that happen at all, is likely in the end to follow a different route than it did 28 years ago. Exactly what is that path? Well, we'll be watching that very closely in the coming year. Next, one area that seemed to have agreement between the panelists was that any real tax reform bill would include both business reform and individual tax reform. That was a view supported by both Republicans and Democrats on the panel. Now that runs somewhat contrary to the administration's stated preference on tax reform, but it does reflect a certain legislative reality. The support, either in Congress or in the public, does not appear to exist to do business reform without simultaneously cleaning up the individual side as well. Certainly, if one side is done, all recognize that the opportunity may never be better to do the other side as well. Third, there was a clear appeal by some on the panel for the administration to get more engaged and committed to the tax reform process. Of course, the administration has produced a framework for business tax reform, but that framework only paints with broad brushstrokes. No matter what one thinks of its policy choices, Chairman Camp's tax reform draft, however, was a complete, comprehensive, and meticulously crafted tax reform proposal. If Treasury were to produce something similar, this would require the allocation of significant Treasury resources to the effort and, like the Camp draft itself, would also implicate a certain level of political risk, which may be viewed as undesirable. Fourth, the issue of revenue neutrality is one that will require further negotiation between the various camps. There was not a consensus among panelists as to whether tax reform should achieve revenue neutrality as an outcome or whether getting the policy right first should be the objective, with revenue consequences as a secondary consideration. Finally, perhaps most importantly, the panel outlined at various points the fundamental difficulty of reconciling the academic notion of tax reform with the political reality. Specifically, it was noted that achieving a certain academic efficiency is fine from a theoretical view, but it's worth remembering that some of the so-called inefficiencies in the code exist for very explicit reasons. Congress put them there to achieve desired policy goals. Stripping them out for efficiency's sake would at the same time defeat the policy objectives of various constituencies. To paraphrase one of the panelists, Kathy Koch, one person's base broadener is somebody else's tax increase. Juggling those competing challenges is why tax reform is so very hard to accomplish. Well, that's just a brief summary of the key points from a thoughtful and insightful discussion of the outlook for tax reform in the next Congress. You can watch the full webcast replay of this session by clicking on the link below. Thanks again for joining me today, and please, if you have any questions on this topic, you can contact me, John Gimigliano, at the contact information on your screen.